The Nintendo DS. No wonder this thing didn't really catch on, right? I mean, just look at that weird 80s throwback design. And the games, Nintendogs, Dr. Kawashima's brain training? Okay, brain age, as they called it in North America. Great, a game for the elderly. Yes, the DS, another one of Nintendo's courageous failures. And yet, alright, that is of course the exact opposite of the truth. The DS was absolutely huge, the biggest handheld of all time, and its innovative and offbeat games sold millions. In fact, it's sold so well it's easy to take it for granted and forget just how strange the DS was. A mutant in the console world in a category all of its own, well, apart from its direct successors. But it is still a games system and a largely 3D focused one at that, so I'm going to try and answer the question, just how powerful is the DS? How does it compare to the N64, the original PlayStation, and of course its only real rival, the PlayStation Portable? So I think the best place to start is with Super Mario 64 DS, one of the launch titles and a pretty bold statement from Nintendo. This machine can do 3D, that's what they were saying, and they must have been pretty confident if they were willing to put such a legendary title front and centre. And that confidence, well, it wasn't misplaced, because this is, well, it's a decent version of Mario 64. As good as the original? Well, let's compare them side by side and get rid of that other screen, which doesn't do a lot in this game. The controls aren't quite as good, the touchpad isn't really a replacement for the analog stick, but DS Mario 64 is okay, a very passable version of the classic in handheld form, with some extra features. And hey, you might even prefer this version because of what it adds and the portability. And the graphics, well, that does provide us with a very handy way of comparing the two systems. There are some obvious stylistic differences. Nintendo went with a more naturalistic look for the DS version, less cartoony. It might seem strange that they'd make such sweeping changes to a classic, but I'm sure this new look has its fans. The next thing you might notice is the resolution. Yes, the N64 version does seem quite a bit less blocky and also just sort of less jagged all round. Part of this is just due to the fact that the N64 has a higher resolution display, smaller pixels. The difference isn't really huge, it's not like high definition versus standard definition, but it is significant. The DS has two screens, but each one is just that good bit less detailed. There's more than just pixel size though, because of the N64's anti-aliasing and smoothing capabilities. It can automatically reduce those jagged lines in a way that the DS can't, and it also has texture filtering, which gives everything a sort of Vaseline smeared look, but maybe one that's arguably more appealing. The DS version also has a sort of jittery quality, one that was pretty common in early 3D games, but not in the original version and not on the N64 in general. Why is this? Well, the 3D models in this and most other 3D games are made up of polygons, triangles usually joined together. The N64 can draw these triangles more accurately than the DS. It's got sub-pixel precision. It handles the situation better when a triangle falls in between 2 points on the screen, basically. This gives it a more solid look, but the N64 also fills in the polygons more accurately. The textures the DS uses can get warped because of the way it projects them onto the surfaces, but the N64 can do this better. Also, the N64 has the ability to do MIP mapping built in. That is, it can automatically show a different version of a texture for objects that are more distant, which improves the look even more. DS games could potentially do this in software, but many games don't bother. The DS, though, does have one real huge advantage over the N64. In fact, nearly every other 3D-based system beats the N64 on this issue, and that's the textures themselves. The situation is complex, but the N64 can only handle 4 kilobytes of textures to fill polygons with at any given moment. That means the textures are often very low resolution, and whilst there are programming tricks to mitigate this, it was a major problem that every game on the system had to deal with. The DS, on the other hand, had up to 512 kilobytes of textures on hand, which means the substance of polygons can be much more detailed. Yes, the N64 can add that Vaseline smear to make things look prettier, and it can project the textures more accurately, but what's underneath has to be simpler. The DS always ends up being blockier, but can be richer and with more complexity. That helps to explain the more naturalistic look. It's just got more realistic textures. Many things on the N64 that are just flat colours now have detail. A situation that's not helped by the size of cartridges. The absolute biggest N64 cartridges were 64 megabytes, and they were few and far between. Nintendo DS cartridges could be up to 512 megabytes, with games 128 megabytes and above being really common. There were very few direct N64 to DS ports, oddly, but comparing sort of like for like, you can definitely see the differences, and I think blockier but richer might be a good way of putting it. And you know what? More inexpensive but richer might be a good way of describing the sponsor of this video, because it's time to say hi to Raycon. So I've been using my Raycon earbuds for a few weeks now, and I've been loving the experience. They are a no BS product that proves you don't always get what you pay for in a good way. These are a premium product at a non-premium price. Raycon are on a mission to prove that you don't have to pay an arm and a leg for high quality sound and essential smart tech features, and I think they have done that. I really like how easy these are to pair with absolutely anything, including my guitar amp, and also these days the Nintendo Switch, which does now support Bluetooth earbuds. They claim up to 8 hours battery life, and in my experience that does seem to be absolutely correct. And I also really like the touch controls on the side here, the buttons that you can press to switch between the various sound profiles and the other functions. It's really intuitive and really easy to use. At the price these are, you could afford 2 pairs and still pay less than what you would do with the big tech brands. They really are fantastic value for money. So if you'd like to support this channel, and it really does do that, if you'd like to support this channel, well, you can get yourself some very nice earbuds thanks to Raycon. So click the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/Chiropolis to get 15% off your Raycon purchase. Okay, we're back in the room. Let's try another comparison now and take a look at Ridge Racer DS. Another launch title, almost, coming out in the first couple of weeks of the DS's life, and once again this isn't a bad version of the popular franchise, and having it in handheld form in 2004 seemed like a great idea. It's fast, it's pretty, and a good all-round arcade racer. And there is another stunningly obvious comparison to make. Another system with Ridge Racer as a launch title, of course the PlayStation. Side by side, the DS maybe wins. Yes, it's got lower resolution, but other than that it does seem to take the lead. The textures are nicer, there's better lighting effects, and noticeably less popping and glitchiness in the 3D models. Yeah, not quite as good as the N64 in this regard. The DS hardware capabilities, though, do put it ahead of the PS1 when it comes to drawing triangles and filling them in accurately. Objects up close tend to look pretty terrible on the PS1, but they can look much better on the DS. It maps the textures better, it handles the geometry better, and it also has hardware Z buffering. Its graphics processor can automatically keep track of the depth of objects in space, which makes rendering the scene much easier than on the PS1. Both of these games run pretty smoothly at 30 frames per second, they both play well. The PS1 maybe has the better sound thanks to its CD audio, but overall I would say the DS takes it here. Things might change though if we do another comparison. This is Race Driver Grid from 2008, a nice looking racing game. But put it next to Gran Turismo 2 and I think the PlayStation really starts to gain ground. Yes, Gran Turismo is still a bit wobbly, there's that glitchy jank that characterised PS1 games, but overall this does look much higher end. Ridge Racer wasn't just a PlayStation launch title, it was amongst the first texture-mapped 3D games released on any platform ever. By the time Gran Turismo 2 came out in 1999, developers had not just got the hang of the PlayStation, but got more used to making 3D games in general. So we've got a higher level of detail, nicer textures. Is it better than Grid on the DS? Well, I think that might be a bit of a judgment call. Gran Turismo has perhaps a bit more variety in its environments and maybe more complex 3D models. On the other hand, Grid seems to have less pop-in and more solid-looking geometry. I am sort of surprised by this. I was really expecting an easy win for Gran Turismo here, but it's not so clear. A big issue with the DS is that it had a hard limit on the number of polygons per frame that it can construct its graphics with. 2048 is the maximum, or about 120,000 per second. What about the PlayStation? Well, that doesn't have a hard limit, but 120,000 per second, or about 2,000 per frame at 60 frames per second probably isn't far from what it can do. About the same as the DS, right? Well, maybe not. With the PlayStation, because of the way it draws its graphics in a frame buffer, if you want more polygons per frame, well, you can if you cut down the frame rate. Gran Turismo 2 runs at 30 frames per second, not the maximum of 60, so you can have more polygons, more detailed models in each frame. If you give yourself more time to draw each frame, you can have more detail. That doesn't work on the DS, which constructs its graphics in a different way, line by line. Gran Turismo 2 was known for its very detailed models, especially the cars, and this trick really helps it. I really thought the DS graphics would suffer more in comparison with the PS1 because of this, but well, the end result isn't so bad. You could say the same things about Ridge Racer Type 4 too, another big, beautiful PS1 racer and another obvious comparison. The stunning backdrops here make a really big impression, a leap forward from early PS1 games, absolutely, but better than the DS? Well, let me know in the comments what you think. Another game we might take a look at is Moon, one of the DS's absolute best looking first person shooters, definitely. But let's put it side by side with Alien Resurrection, one of the PlayStation's absolute best looking shooters, and we've got another really nice comparison. Both these games really push their respective systems very hard, and they both look absolutely superb. Moon obviously has less of that jittery polygon warping that we talked about, but Alien seems to have better, more atmospheric lighting effects. The DS actually had some hardware-based light and shadow capabilities that the PS1 lacked, but the PlayStation was able to recreate these effects in other ways. In these more artificial environments, the slightly lower detail of the DS seems to matter even less, and makes for another really great looking game that holds its own against anything the PS1 can do. When you think about it, comparing the DS with the N64 and the PlayStation is a bit of an apples and oranges thing. They're obviously different machines with different purposes. Their internals are all very, very different too. I mean, I could list the hardware specs of all of them, but I don't think we'd learn much. Side-by-side comparisons like these can perhaps give a better idea of how the DS performs, even if it is a bit subjective. The DS is more modern, clearly coming out 10 years after the launch of the PlayStation, and even though it's a far cry from today's system, its design is a bit more sophisticated. It might not be as powerful in some ways as these other two, but it can do things they can't, or at least struggle with. Yes, it's got a lot of tricks up its sleeve, something that I'm going to look at in another video. The DS, though, wasn't alone in the marketplace. There was another rival that came out just weeks after its debut. Yes, it is, of course, the PlayStation Portable. And well, to put it bluntly, when it comes to graphical power, there's just no contest. The PSP wins by an absolute mile. It's got more everything: CPU power, GPU power, memory. It leaves the PS1 and the N64 far behind too. Ridge Racer illustrates it perfectly. The PSP often doesn't seem to lag that far behind even the mighty PS2. It's been a while since I've played any PSP games. I forgot just how good they could look. There doesn't seem to be a definitive answer when it comes to polygon counts on the PSP. The range reported by different sources is very broad, but we're talking millions per second rather than thousands most likely. It's hard to find many straight, side-by-side comparisons I can show you with any system, the PSP included. The DS had such a unique library. GTA Chinatown Wars is another one, and yes, the PSP version is of course leagues ahead. The DS did have features the PSP did not, the dual screen touchscreen of course being number one. That was the thing that really stood out about the DS, wasn't it? And it's easy to forget just how big of a thing that was. The dual screen thing, well, that might not be quite as enduring, but touch control, that has hung around on many devices, and the DS was an absolute pioneer in this field. If you've watched Modern Vintage Gamer's masterful video on DS graphics, you'll know it has a lot of special capabilities when it comes to 2D. Does that put it ahead of the PSP when it comes to 2D games? Well, no, not really. The second screen, of course, does add some space to do things the PSP can't, but when it comes to actual 2D graphics, there's nothing the DS can do that the PSP can't recreate with its hardware, even if it is totally 3D focused. The DS might be easier to make games for, though. It's got a sort of 2D, 3D hybrid graphics system. Its 2D capabilities are tile-based like most old-school 2D systems, a really insanely powered Super NES or a souped-up Game Boy Advance. Overlaid on that there is a 3D layer that, as we've seen, compares fairly well with first-gen 3D systems like the PS1. This makes it a sort of bridge between generations. If your software house had been focused on Game Boy Advance software, well, you could make the jump to the DS fairly easily. If you wanted to do 2D style games in the way you had done before, well, you absolutely could. But if you wanted to add a hint of 3D on top, you could do that too. And you could go all out and do a fairly decent first-person shooter or a proper 3D platformer as well if you wanted. The DS must have been an attractive platform to make games for. And just the concept of the thing, the dual-screen, touchscreen thing, it added so much, and that's the elephant in the room when you're discussing the DS. Comparing it with any sort of other game system hardware except its direct successors, well, it's not going to be able to take account of its unique features. Way more than just a gimmick, the DS offered games you literally could not play anywhere else. Not just system exclusives, not just portable versions of games you played elsewhere, but unique experiences that also happened to be portable. The PlayStation Portable didn't fail, it sold 80 million, but well, the DS sold nearly double that, and in fact more than any other system apart from the PS2, which beat it by a tiny margin. So just how powerful is the DS? Well, powerful enough to be a worldwide phenomenon. So I think the end of another video approaches. Thank you to my Patreon supporters once again, it really does make all the difference. If you're watching this and you think you'd like to join them and help me out, well, please do, as that would be really superb. Just $1 a month is fine, there is a link below. And if you're wondering, yes, I am going to do a games that push the limits of the DS as well as this video, where I will take a look at games that really push the system the hardest. If you can think of anything I should include, well, please do let me know in the comments below. And yes, what about the DSi 2? Wasn't that more powerful? Well, yeah, it certainly was, but not many games really used that extra power, but I think it will make an appearance in that limit-pushing video. I've tried to come up with other points of comparison, but well, there's not really anything else I could think of unless it was the Nokia N-Gage, so do speak up if you would like to see the N-Gage versus DS comparison video sometime. That might be quite interesting. Anyway, that's the end of the video for now. I will say goodbye and thanks for watching.